letter calls for Google to recognize that they're being persecuted not for real crimes that they've committed, but precisely for the virtues that they've demonstrated in their business.
The idea that hatred of business and hatred of capitalists is often motivated by hatred of the fact that they are productively virtuous, that they are good. This notion that there's such a thing as hatred of the good for being good is something very unique to Ayn Rand. It's an idea that I think people have a hard time understanding how that could be a motivation for something like a government case. But I think as we start to dig more into what this case is about, we'll see how it can be and how it is, in fact, the motivation here.
Hopefully, with challenging the premises behind their attacks, with calling out the motivations of their attackers and the recognizing their moral stance, Google could fuel their own fight and maybe even help fuel the fight against antitrust and persecuting business as such.
We've just entered a new political period in the United States that promises turmoil and uncertainty, but one thing has not changed: the witch hunt against the biggest and the most successful U.S. companies, primarily through the use of arbitrary, vague, and undefinable antitrust laws. In this rhetoric and in the choice of a candidate to lead the antitrust division at the Department of Justice, President Trump indicated that big tech will not get a break. But here at the Ayn Rand Institute, we commit to lend our voice in defense of what Ayn Rand called America's persecuted minority, big business. And to start, we will begin by defending Google, the company that has become the antitrust punching bag for anything that it does. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. My name is Ben Bayer, a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. With me is Robertas Bakula. He is Graduate Center Associate at ARI, and Robertas is one of the co-authors of an open letter we recently published to Google about the persecution that it has been enduring over the last 4+ years as it's responded to an antitrust case and decision against it. So, Robertas, since you're one of the co-authors of this letter, why don't we start by, could you please just sum up for us the message that we're sending in this letter? What's its content, and what are we trying to accomplish by sending this message?
Sure. So the letter has a few goals, but the primary goal is this. Like you said, Google has been fighting antitrust now for years, and it's fighting 3 active cases, if not more, but 3 major active cases right now. And it's only one of many companies through now more of 100 years, more than a century of history of antitrust laws that's facing this kind of persecution when it stands at a pinnacle or at the top of its industry. And in Google's case, it's the search industry, online search industry, and the advertisement industry. So the way Google has been fighting, and any successful company basically what has been fighting antitrust up till now and through years, is to try to reason with the antitrust persecutors and attackers, and reason in a sense, look, show them everything we can to demonstrate how competitive, how innovative, how productive, how ingenious, and how foresighted these companies are, and that their success, their dominance, their position in the market is earned for that success and productive ability. And in hopes of, actually, this reasoning was in hope that if the antitrust attackers, if those who accuse Google of having this big monopoly power, that's a vacant and defined sort of concept as used by DOJ or antitrusters, is if only they can see how good we are, then maybe they will get off and leave us alone and actually let us build, let us create, let us provide value, let us run our companies. Unfortunately, this is not what happens. And whatever evidence Microsoft provided in the early 2000s in a case against them, and Google is now building a mountain of evidence about how great their company is, how many competitors they're facing, how constantly innovative and earning their success they have to be, the antitrust attackers are undeterred, and the question is why. And I think the purpose of this letter, from our perspective and from my perspective as I was writing it, is to try to tell Google that no matter how many facts they will provide about their virtues, this will not fend off attacks, antitrust attacks. It will attract them. It's the success and the superiority of Google in their industry that in the first place brought antitrust attacks against them. So while we are now legal advisors, in no way at ERI, we're not offering them legal advice and how to fight those battles. They have to sort of play the game the way they can, the rigged game against them the best they can. But in addition to that, in this letter, we're expressing our support to Google and saying that Department of Justice, who is supposed to represent the people, the customers or the consumers or the public, they don't stand for us, and that they don't speak for us, and that anybody who understands how important and beneficial Google was to their lives and their right to run their business the way they see fit should stand up and tell the Department of Justice to back off. And Google should do the same. The letter calls for Google to recognize that they're being persecuted not for something, no real harms or real crimes that they've committed, but precisely for the virtues that they've demonstrated in their business. So that's what we call to recognize with this letter, both primarily for Google itself, so that they have the energy, the moral support to fight their battles, but to everybody else who could both suffer from antitrust in the future or want to support the companies against what I call antitrust inquisition.
This point in your letter that Google won't help itself by touting the quality of its product because they're actually being persecuted for their productive virtue, I think is really important. And I mentioned at the top of the episode that antitrust laws as such, in our view, are arbitrary, undefinable, unjust. And part of the reason that we take that view in opposition to the antitrust laws as such, not just particular applications of them, is that we agree with Ayn Rand's view that these are unjust laws. And a big part of why they're unjust is this point that you are highlighting, that they are actually used to target the most productive companies for what's good about them. That's a very distinctively objectivist point that Ayn Rand makes. There are many reasons to oppose antitrust laws. This one of them is really core to her moral defense of capitalism. The idea that hatred of business and hatred of capitalists is often motivated by hatred of the fact that they are productively virtuous, that they are good. This notion that there's such a thing as hatred of the good for being good is something very unique to Ayn Rand. It's an idea that I think people have a hard time understanding how that could be a motivation for something like a government case. But I think as we start to dig more into what this case is about, we'll see how it can be and how it is, in fact, the motivation here. So, Robertas, maybe I think one thing we can do to update our audience on this case, since the last time you and I did a podcast on this topic, there have been developments in this case. We've seen, for example, the Department of Justice, after Judge Mehta made his decision affirming that Google was a so-called monopolist, we've seen the Department of Justice then make its recommendations for how this alleged crime should be remedied. And I think there's very interesting things to observe about this. What can you tell us about what remedies the DOJ has now recommended to this alleged crime?
Yeah, so the case has entered what we call the remedy stage that should be or is scheduled to be resolved by August this year, 2025. But in the meanwhile, since we did our podcast and talked about this case earlier, yes, the DOJ proposed several things. They looked, okay, so Judge Mehta agreed with us, they say. It announced Google to hold monopoly power in these markets. Here is what we propose to solve for these problems. And I need to understand the remedies. I think I need to remind a little bit what was the core issue of the case. And the core issue of the whole case against Google, one of the cases, but which we discussed, the information distribution case, search engine distribution case, is the exclusive agreements that Google makes with providers, especially Apple, primarily Apple, but also Android device makers and network providers and other browsers like Mozilla Firefox. The default agreement says the Google search engine is the default engine that a consumer, without making any choices, any settings, just types in into whatever search window they have on their device, and Google search is what powers the search to the internet. And if Google is a default on, let's say, an iPhone through Safari, then Apple is getting paid billions of dollars for holding Google as a default. And that was this agreement called exclusive agreement in the case, prevents allegedly other companies from, or other search engines to compete with Google, because Google is set as a default, even though people can change it back if they want, change it in the settings as they want. So for more information on that case, you would want to look at the podcast we did before. So again, the core is exclusive agreements. What does the DOJ come in to propose to resolve it? And it says Google has to sell Chrome. They call it divest Chrome, but it's basically get rid of Chrome. And the reasoning is that they should not be able to control both the search engine and the distribution channel, which is the browser through which people access the search engine. So they should split the two and get rid of the business of Chrome. They also propose that if that's not enough, if that will not be enough, then they should probably get rid of Android operating system as a business too, because Android is another distribution channel for which people reach internet through Google search. So this is another thing they want to do. They should share their data, search data, with other competitors. That's the next proposal. So the reasoning behind that proposal is it's really hard to build a competing search engine without having so much data as Google has from previous searches and user behavior that they use to improve the quality and sort of the quality of the research results. So Google now is supposed to share the data with all their competitors and basically give them that tool to build a competing search engine. And that's all in addition to also banning the exclusive agreements that were core of the case. So this is a whole package of remedies, which Google, I think, legitimately called a very radical agenda. Is if the exclusive agreements were the point of contention, where did selling of whole big parts and most important and most innovative parts of their business, the browser, the Android operating system, the data that they use to improve their product, all of those is Google recognizing, and I think rightly recognizing, that this has nothing really to do with the case itself, even though the case itself, the Google is going to appeal, and it's quite an atrocious case for such. But even taking the court opinion, the remedies were incredibly disassociated. They were disassociated from the solutions from the alleged problem that the Department of Justice themselves sort of brought up.
Yeah, one thing to note about the DOJ recommendations you just cited, Robertas, is how they implicitly affirm the point that we've been making, that this antitrust persecution is persecution for their productive virtue. If Chrome weren't such a good browser, which I use by choice, which I know a lot of people use by choice, there wouldn't be any utility in taking it away from them, giving it to somebody else. If the data that Google had collected from its decades of providing excellent search technology weren't excellent data because of that excellent search technology, there wouldn't be any utility in taking it away from them, sharing it with everybody else. So these penalties, at the very least, affirm the point that we're making, that they're being punished for actually having produced really good technology that people want to use, that people would therefore want to take from them if they were an envious lot who didn't want to have to build it for themselves. But what's Google's response to these proposed remedies?
The response is twofold. First, Google reaffirms and enhances what they have been doing through this whole case throughout, like I said in the beginning, and it's highlighting all the virtues and abilities that they have. So they are highlighting how many competitors they're faced before and they're facing right now, or potentially facing in the future. They're highlighting how innovative they were and what business foresight they had. Like, for example, they were thinking, they really early recognized the explosive growth search will have on mobile devices, and they invested in it early, which gave him a huge advantage with the explosion in the market of mobile devices in the late 2000s. So they're showing that their market share is being challenged by multiple competitors on many fronts, and that the only way they're keeping it is through innovation and increased quality and the voluntary, not only consent, but voluntary use and support of their customers. So that's one part, and they have been doing it the whole time, and they're continuing to emphasize this. The second thing, though, they're reacting to the DOJ saying that their agenda is radical, and it's a radical interventionist agenda. They called it in one of their responses on Google's blog, and they say, even if we take your case, which we don't, we will appeal the case. We already know that, but even if we took the ruling and thought about what it says, what is the core issue of the ruling, the exclusive agreement, then the remedies don't even address that, and they go far above and beyond that would be required to resolve the alleged crime, which my tongue barely turns to call it a crime, to have a legal agreement that everybody else can hold, but Google suddenly can't because they're so dominant. So the remedies don't have basically nothing to do with the alleged problem, and will not help solve the problem, but create many, many other problems. But primarily, just destroy Google as it is. Just put Google down without real evidence or potential of helping anybody out.
Yeah, I said before that I thought that the remedies really underscore how the real motivation here is hatred of their productive virtue. And I think Google's point in response that they're out of proportion to the alleged problem is another sign of that. Because if you thought that there was some elimination of competition that came from the fact that Google appears as a default search engine, which I don't think is actually true, but if someone actually thought that was plausible, then yeah, the remedy would be, well, you're not allowed to make it the default search engine. It's not, we're going to take away the browser. Now, it's true, of course, that taking away the browser gives them one less way of promoting their search engine, but what it really points to is the motivation here is really just to be punitive. You're really good. We want to make you less good. We want to make you tear up the different pieces of your business, which have seamlessly been integrated to deliver a unified experience to us as users. And I mean, it's really vicious in every sense of the word. The other thing to say about what you mentioned and about their response, they're calling it a radical interventionist solution or proposal. And I mean, in some sense, that's true. It's true that this kind of proposal goes to the root of what motivates them, which I think is a kind of hatred of productive virtue. I suspect, though, that the sense in which Google means to use that phrase is, in effect, to say, and there are other things in their filing that suggest this, that in effect the DOJ is just going too far. That if they pulled back a little, if they gave us a more moderate penalty for our productive virtue, that would be acceptable. But I mean, that is, I think, a kind of concessionary language, suggesting that which most kind of corporate entities, you can expect that they're going to use concessionary language. They're not actually opposed to antitrust law at the root like we are, but it's worth pointing out that an actually radical response to this radical proposed remedy would be to question the right of the government even to have the power to shut down and tear apart businesses on such trumped up grounds as being quote unquote anti-competitive. But tell us more about the proposed remedies that Google's offering as an alternative, probably because it's legally required to.
Yeah, so that is a legal requirement, and Google acknowledges in their proposal that we're filing this because the legal process requires us to respond to the DOJ and to respond to the court decision with our proposed remedies. And it makes sense that they would do that. It's like if in my mind, if they're losing the case, for example, in the future, if they're about to lose a case, it's better to minimize the damage as much as possible if you can't completely get rid of it. But that minimization looks like that. Google proposes literally to remedy what was the issue of the case, and that's one. It's the exclusive agreements to make them shorter, so agreements wouldn't be made for years. Like they wouldn't sign an agreement, let's say with Apple or with Mozilla, that Google has to be a default for years, and then we will review maybe in 3, 4, 5 years. They would give an option to review every 12 months. The contract would end every 12 months and would have to be renewed every 12 months, so that every company like Mozilla, Apple, or Android device producers could say, okay, let us see, maybe there is another new competitor, or maybe there is another deal that we can strike. So it gives a little more flexibility to them. And the second thing is they address the sort of Android operating system issue, which was that if you want Google to be your default search engine, it would come in a deal usually preloaded with other Google services like Google Play and Chrome and the Google search engine and other Google services as a package, as a bundle. So now they're saying, all right, we will give some flexibility and allow to, let's say, have Chrome without necessarily preloading the Google Play Store, or the other way around. So the Android device makers could have a little more choice in what do they want to preload as default for their consumers. So they say their proposals actually address what was the issue of the court in the court case, and that the remedies are proportional to the problems allegedly established in the case. And again, I have to clarify that Google is doing that only because they have to do it in the process, probably as a safeguard, I don't know, but they are appealing the case as such in the future, at least they promise to. So I'm taking these proposals with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and obviously I don't think they should even have to propose alternate remedies like that. And while obviously it'll be better for them if they only get that punishment and not what the DOJ is proposing, it would be better if they didn't even have to face that. Nobody should have the right to be able to renegotiate their contracts or the terms of the contracts they've entered into voluntarily with these third parties like Apple. And like just the other day, Apple tried to file a lawsuit putting an injunction against this proposed penalty because Apple wants to be able to pay Google or be paid by Google to feature their search engine. Apple very much appreciates the money. And so granted that they are being forced to offer these proposed remedies, Robertas, in addition to whatever legal strategies they're now pursuing to seek some superior remedy to this decision, what else is there that Google should do or recognize if it wants to understand what has led to this decision and what kind of attacks, the nature of the enemies it's facing?
Right. So that's probably the most important thing that we would like Google to take away from our letter and everybody else, and is that Google is this time the 3 cases they're facing and more the cases they faced in the past and probably will face in the future is just another iteration or another example of the application of the antitrust, non-objective antitrust laws. Through decades now, every company that faces antitrust, they have to fight. They fight in this way, and the defenders of those companies often also fight in this way. is to argue on the grounds that the antitrust laws establish. Is to say, you say we're anti-competitive, we will show that we're competitive. You say we hold monopoly power, raise prices, we will show that our prices are lower and our consumers are satisfied. You will say we have big market share, we will try to argue with your definition of a market and show that we're actually not that big. So whatever the argument and defense is, it's on the terms of the attackers. And again, I understand that completely, because when attackers hold legal power, there is only so much you can do, and you have to fight by every means you can. But year after year, decade after decade, we see that the persecution of most successful and large American business, what Ayn Rand called America's persecuted minority, big business, it continues undeterred, unhindered, and goes from one company to another, and sometimes back to the same company if it's become successful again, suddenly. And the only way to, in addition to fighting sort of the battles at hand in front of them and trying to save themselves from the attack today, they have to recognize and start fighting the battle long term, which is what we try to fight, and we call them to fight with us together. And it's to acknowledge what and recognize what are the motives behind antitrust enforcers, attackers, inquisitors, whatever you want to call them, and that they choose the companies that were the best and brightest and the most successful. And that's what makes them the target of antitrust. That's versus the moral depravity of targeting the best of the best and using the sort of unlimited government arbitrary power to define the crimes however we want. Remember that those exclusive agreements against that Google is attacked for, they're perfectly legal for many companies, and every company almost is involved in some exclusive agreement, but suddenly Google isn't. So this complete rejection of equal protection before the law, and only by recognizing that their attackers will use any tool that they can come up with in their power to go after them, track them down, whether it's to take their products and take what they produce, their wealth, and distribute it to wannabe competitors, envious competitors, or just I don't know anybody, or just because to make their political careers, whatever the reasoning can be or motivations behind. It's we're going after the biggest and the most successful, and we need to defend against that. We and Google and everybody else needs to call out that this is precisely what's happening, and the only way to stop that is to challenge the whole premise of antitrust laws as such, and the persecution of business for conducting business successfully.
Yeah, it's hard to know if a company in a position like that has the ability to come out against antitrust laws as such, whether they have the philosophical ability or whether they have even the legal ability, because they're already being legally mandated to propose alternative remedies. But it does strike me that even just to name what we are arguing is the motive of these laws, without even necessarily taking a position on the laws as such, just to name the fact that the people who are using these laws are so obviously targeting people for their virtue, just to give voice to that recognition, I think would give them the moral high ground in a way that they've previously been unwilling to take, and it would gain more respect from the public. I think that would recognize it as a kind of breath of fresh air, honesty, unwillingness to apologize for actually being good. And it's really something that I hope the Google leadership seriously considers if they're listening. And Robertas, it's not that that Google has no understanding of what might be motivating this attack. What have they said about this, and what can you say in response?
Yeah, in short, in one of the interviews, I think, or press media, I don't remember where it was, but Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, he said, "Look, with our size and scale, this I think scrutiny is inevitable," and that's a quote. So I think in that, I can't say for sure how he thinks about it, but at least in that phrase there is an indication that we became a target because of how big we are. It's the first reason that brought these attacks on us was not some clear crime, was not some clear even violation or harm that anybody pointed to. It's just because Google is big and dominant. Let's look into it and see what we can find. And I think that's a sort of at least in a direction, an accurate evaluation of what happens, and towards the argument that we're making, that what puts Google and other successful companies on the radar of antitrust is precisely their success. But what I want to say to him and to everyone is that it's not just the size and the scale. It is the virtues of Google that put them there, that put them on the target, and it's also not inevitable. And what with this letter and with this podcast, hopefully, what I want to sort of transmit is that we shouldn't just shrug off the fact that antitrust is the law of the land, or the attack on big business is happens inevitable. You become big, and inevitably people will scrutinize you. We shouldn't take that as a default, and we shouldn't agree with that. Yes, this is what we have to live with. We don't. If people recognize that bigness has nothing to do with whatever harms allegedly the big business necessarily does, not to say that there is nothing to be found ever, but that it doesn't have to be this way, and that it's often that first we need to look what success and virtues brought that business where it is now, and that it calls often and usually for admiration and respect and appreciation rather than persecution.
Yeah, I think it's noteworthy that it's not like it's a coincidence that Google started being targeted for antitrust around the same time as Facebook, as Amazon, as Apple. It's not like all of these companies just suddenly started to commit crimes all at the same time. No, it's that they were all becoming very successful. And that's why they were the main targets at the same time. Now, at the top of the show, Robertas, I mentioned that even though we have a new administration in power in this country, there wasn't a lot of reason to expect much change in this trend of attacking successful tech companies with the incoming administration. And could you say more about how we might why we might think that's true?
Yeah, there are a few pieces of evidence that I think indicate that. And one, the major case on the search distribution that I've been focusing most about has been going on now for years. Google has been fighting the Department of Justice. It started under Trump administration. It was conceived of and even filed before he left office. So it already indicates that even during his administration, the animosity was already there and building, and there is no reason to think something really changed right now, especially given what appointments Trump is considering. So the replacement for the Antitrust Division Director at the Department of Justice, she is Gail Slater, and she is no known friend of big tech, if you will. From her comments herself and evaluations of her, she would take over the Google's case and other antitrust cases and try to see them to completion. There is not much evidence or evidence at all that she would rethink or take the antitrust division at the Department of Justice in some other direction than Cantor did. And even in discussing that appointment, Trump tweeted quite recently that big tech has been, he said, running wild for years, in his words, and stifling competition and reducing innovation, all the same mantra, and that under his administration, a crackdown on big tech, if not increase, will at least continue. So I think from all some of the evidence that we can find now, although it's hard to predict what will actually happen, and appointment is not confirmed yet, but there is at least no indication that some positive changes are coming. That's for sure.
Robertas, just to start to wrap things up, what are some basic pieces of intellectual ammunition that you would like the Google executives to walk away with after having listened to this podcast?
So first, I want them to recognize that they're on the right side here, that they are being attacked and persecuted and the almost forced to give up parts of their business, of their achievements, for how good they were at reaching them and achieving them. And they should recognize that they're here in the right, and they should stand with all their mind and all their confidence and self-esteem that they and people who recognize how productive and successful they were are supporting them, and they should fight and see this battle to the end and not give up, to not settle down with the attackers to as much of the extent as they can. Second point, and I think they need to recognize too, is the nature of antitrust laws as such, and that the whole system can and should be challenged from the ground up, because it has been used. Google is, like I tried to mention, is only one of the last iterations of how these laws, and definitely not the last, but latest iterations of how these laws are being used to go after the successful and the productive. And those ideas, hopefully with challenging the premises behind their attacks, with calling out the motivations of their attackers, and the recognizing their moral stance, Google could fuel their own fight, and maybe even help fuel the fight against antitrust and persecuting business as such.
Yeah, Robertas, a few times now you've mentioned the idea that business people were a persecuted minority, which is probably a provocative sounding idea for many people. It's an idea, of course, we get from Ayn Rand. She had a lecture called America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business. And I thought to close things, I would share a passage from that lecture/essay, which we'll give a resource to in a moment. But she says the following: remember how much you owe to this minority and what disgraceful persecution it is enduring. Remember also that the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. What should we do about it? We should demand a reexamination and revision of the entire issue of antitrust. We should challenge its philosophical, political, economic, and moral base. The repeal of the antitrust laws should be our ultimate goal. It will require a long intellectual and political struggle. That's from Ayn Rand. It's the intellectual and political struggle is one that we are hoping to provide intellectual ammunition for here at the Ayn Rand Institute. And so by way of offering that ammunition, let me share with you some resources that our audience may find useful in understanding this issue better and our stance on it. First of all, there is this open letter to Google, which Robertas helped to draft, which we recently posted on our journal, New Ideal, as well as on a dedicated Substack, a Substack page that is part of a special project of the Ayn Rand Institute, the Atlas Circle. This is a new initiative by ARI dedicated to providing the kind of intellectual ammunition to business people that they need to defend their industries on moral grounds. So another place you can visit is the landing page here for the Atlas Circle. We also mentioned that Robertas and I had done a previous podcast analyzing the recent antitrust case against Google. We looked closely at the filings, at the various accusations, analyzed and critiqued them. So you can take a look at that. That's the vicious antitrust case against Google, which we did about 4 months ago. And last but not least, Ayn Rand's seminal essay on the subject of antitrust law and why she opposed it, which is America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business. Is both a essay that appears in her book Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and also a lecture that she gave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Click that bell to get notifications for when we go live or post new recordings. If you're watching the recording, please be sure to like it, to leave a comment, to share it with friends, to help this message get out into the social media atmosphere that big tech has created. And if you have questions or comments about today's episode, send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read everything that comes in, try to answer what we can. Sometimes we do episodes on topics that you suggest. So thanks again, Robertas, for your work on this open letter and sharing your knowledge on the subject with us today. Hope to see you again on more episodes.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ben.